Right. In creating Consecration here at Russian River Brewery, we wanted to look at our overall barrel program, which was that we had already done Temptation with Chardonnay barrels. We had done Supplication with Pinot Noir barrels, and it was very natural to fall into Cabernet Sauvignon barrels. But you may be surprised why we did it. It seems like a natural fit, but we really went that direction because as we started to see the scope of the local wine industry, getting Chardonnay and Pinot Noir barrels were getting harder and harder to get because wineries were starting to convert their Chard barrels or white wine barrels into red wine barrels. And typically, at the end of the day, a winery that makes a vast array of varieties always ends up with a Cabernet. Not always, but in many cases. So Cabernet is usually the last wine that a barrel may get used for. So going with the Cabernet barrels was a sort of a natural choice because there was a lot of them here in the area. The next idea that we went with was that we wanted it to be a shorter barrel age period so that we could turn these barrels more often, but that was also based on the idea that we could get Cabernet barrels more readily and more easily. So we decided that so a shorter aging period. If we needed to turn the barrels, it usually wasn't a problem because they were available on a pretty regular basis. From there, we looked at the flavor components of what was going to go into the beer and have them match what would come out of the barrels. So when you drink Cabernet Sauvignon, oftentimes you get tobacco, chocolate, you'll get fruit flavors of currants in particular, is something that I taste in Cabernet a lot. So we kind of worked backwards from there. We knew what we'd get out of the wine barrel from the wine itself that was still in the wood. So we built a darker beer that was going to give some chocolate, some tobacco flavors, a little bit of burnt flavors from the dark malts, and get some of the nice traditional kind of rummy type flavors that you may get from Special B and some of the Belgian candy syrup. And all these things I felt would combine pretty nicely with the chocolate tobacco flavors that was going to come out of the barrels, as well as, we're not even talking about the wood flavors yet, the tannins, the oak that's still there. But the fruit component was the most interesting component. I love making barrel-aged beers where we add a secondary fermentable to it. And in this case, we chose to go with currants because, as I spoke of earlier, oftentimes you drink Cabernet Sauvignon, you get a little bit of a currant flavor, and that's that's really a great flavor. So that that blended with the actual fruit itself and the flavor that the currants added. The currants also added the secondary sugar for the Brettanomyces to ferment on that took the alcohol up from 8.5 to 9.5 or so % alcohol before the beer would actually come out of the barrels. When I look at what we did with Consecration, oftentimes it's tough to think from a homebrewer standpoint, how could I try to, not necessarily duplicate that beer, but use it as an inspiration, use it as an example. And it's tough because it's tough to do a 50 or 60 gallon barrel. But one thing I was thinking of is you could get some oak chips from your local homebrew shop. You could use them for a while, strip out a lot of the oak flavor so you're not getting an abundance of oak flavor in your beer. And then maybe you could take those oak chips and soak them in your favorite Cabernet Sauvignon and then use those in a carboy or a bucket or what have you with some Brettanomyces, lacto, pedio, and kind of replicate what we've done on you're replicating it on a smaller scale. Another thinking is that, well, you're not getting the oxygen uptake which you would get through the barrels, but a small 6-gallon bucket will actually pick up a pretty good amount of oxygen, and in fact I think you have more oxygen uptake there than you do in an actual wine barrel. So you could start in a plastic bucket and then maybe switch it over to a carboy so you don't get too much oxygen uptake, and thus you'd have too much acetobacter. So maybe some sort of combination with a plastic bucket, a carboy, and using oak chips. You could certainly buy currants, dried currants from the store pretty easily, and kind of have your own version of of Consecration, and who knows, home brewing's all about innovation and doing your own thing. So maybe you'll find something you like even better than than the example I just gave.